Yeah, so today I'm going to be talking some about the clean electricity law that kind of got us into the work of doing energy strategy and for that matter, transmission corridor planning. As I mentioned before, I work for the Department of Commerce, which is a multi-program agency covering lots of different aspects. I'm in the energy program myself, but try to reflect that broader vision that we have of serving the communities of the state in lots of different ways. So the Clean Energy Transformation Act, or CETA, was passed by the legislature in 2019 and signed by Governor Inslee that year. We describe it as providing for clean, affordable, reliable, and equitable electricity service to serve the needs of our state, going indefinitely forward into the future. It does apply to all of the electric utilities in the state and their provision of electricity to retail customers in the state. There are three kind of big milestones on the path to 100% clean electricity. By 2025, the utilities need to eliminate coal from their retail electricity portfolios. That would include the coal strip plant in Montana, even though it's in another state. The Washington utilities will no longer be able to use it to serve retail customers. And then, any other coal-fired plants. It doesn't stop an in-state plant like Centralia from operating if it were not used to serve Washington customers, but it's being retired at that point anyway under a prior law and agreement. So then by 2030, the utilities need to achieve a greenhouse gas neutral outcome for their electricity supply. This means that at least 80% of the electricity that's used for retail service has to be either renewable or non-emitting. We had a little discussion earlier, footnote 2, what non-emitting means. In this statute, it means things that are not renewable, but nonetheless don't have greenhouse gas emissions. I tend to think of nuclear as being the non-emitting example, but it doesn't actually say that in the statute. Then the other 20%, a utility during this period could still use natural gas to provide electricity in Washington. But if they do that, they need to offset that electricity with an alternative compliance option, renewable energy certificates, which represent electricity generation somewhere else that's renewable. The credits from that can be used for that 20% if a utility is using fossil fuels there. And then by 2045, the utilities need to achieve a 100% renewable or non-emitting supply. So at that point, those options for alternative compliance cease to apply. So this kind of sums it up, these two standards on the right, the 80% and then 100%. And then on the left, we've got our greenhouse gas emissions limits that have been enacted by the legislature. And these, really do go together. The electricity supply not only directly reduces emissions to get us on that path toward 2050, but then it becomes a source of energy that can be used to replace fossil fuels in other areas. So we really do see the requirements of CETA as being the kind of the ground floor of our overall strategy for achieving those greenhouse gas emissions limits. I mentioned that equitable and affordable are also important parts of the CETA law and our transition. I think it's a really important element of CETA that it kind of adds a new concept to our definition of public interest for the electric utility sector. And it now includes equitable distribution of the benefits of clean energy. And then it has more specific requirements where utilities will be required to provide energy assistance to low-income customers. I think just about everyone was doing that already, but it does become a legal requirement to do that. And then they and our agency need to assess the energy burden that customers face and the adequacy of energy assistance programs. We need to start looking more at non-energy impacts of resource decisions. Again, this is something that was common practice before, but it has more emphasis. And then utilities now need to assess the impacts on vulnerable populations and highly impacted communities as they're doing their resource planning. These are elements that are actually incorporated directly into the 2030 and 2045 standards. It's not, like an add-on off to the side or somewhere else like that. It's kind of fundamental to those two standards. And then in terms of affordability, CETA does have a mechanism to ensure that the cost impact will not be excessive for customers. If a utility found that meeting those standards that I talked about would require rate increases above a certain level, they're allowed to basically slow down for a little while in order to avoid that kind of cost increase and still eventually meet the standards that are required. And then reliability or resource adequacy is another important element of CETA. Again, this is another area where utilities have always placed a lot of emphasis on the reliability of their service, but it's been made more explicit in our statutes that they do that. Under CETA, each utility is required to adopt an explicit resource adequacy standard and then use that in its resource planning. There's a safety valve provision where if reliability is in jeopardy, they're allowed to suspend operation of CETA. And then the law directs our agency to assess this overall law starting in 2023, and to do that with consultation of a whole host of experts and stakeholders. Just to give you a little context about, well, what does 80% look like compared to the current situation? This graph, I think, maybe is helpful in that. The left-hand column shows the resource mix of the state overall. And I drew a line there at 80%. Those top three sections, the ones that are kind of shaded, those are the ones that aren't eligible under CETA, under the 80% standard. That would include coal, natural gas, and then unspecified source electricity. If you don't know where it is coming from, then it's presumed not to be eligible. So the state as a whole needs to get from a little under 70% up to 80%. But the burden is not evenly spread. So the middle column is investor-owned utilities, and then the right-hand column is consumer-owned utilities, like the city utilities or public utility districts or cooperatives. The consumer-owned utilities as a group start above 80% already. There are a couple of exceptions for that. and it's the investor-owned utilities that have the furthest to go to meet that 2030 standard. So that's, oh, and one other thing I wanted to mention about CETA is the same bill also did two other things. One is it created the work group that we're all serving on, and it directed our agency to develop a new state energy strategy, which is what I'm going to be talking about next. But first, I thought I would pause and see if there are any questions about CETA itself.
Great. Thank you, Glenn. I did not get any questions in the chat, so I'm going to invite folks to go ahead and either jump in or raise their hand if they've got questions or comments or thoughts that they'd like, questions for Glenn or comments or thoughts regarding any of the content that Glenn shared there on CETA.
And you know, I'm guessing this is going to be the more familiar part for many of the people on the work group. And I'm happy to jump into the energy strategy if there are no pressing questions.
Any questions from folks? Okay, Glenn, let's go energy strategy then. Let's
do it. Energy strategy. So, and you see here the website for the energy strategy. I would invite and encourage you to read further on this. I'm really going to be talking today about the modeling that we did to support the energy strategy, and then the electricity related results. So
excuse me.
Yeah.
Hey, Glenn, I'm sorry. This is Nicholas Garcia. I apologize for interrupting, but I did have a question on your chart that had the 3 bars. I'm presuming that was from 2020 or 2019 information. Do you have any sense with the heat dome that we had, if it's changed at all over time? If you don't, that's fine. I'm just kind of curious.
Yeah, I don't know. I think this might even be 2018 data. It doesn't change a whole lot, but it's either 2018 or 2019.
Okay.
And I really don't have any more recent info than that.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Nicholas. I'm sorry if I missed your hand up there. I apologize.
So the energy strategy, we were directed by the legislature to do that. Interesting side note, Rob's firm, Ross Strategic, managed the stakeholder work that we did, the advisory committee work for that project. So to get a sense about our future under the, as part of this energy strategy, the modeling work that we did looked at all of the uses of energy in our economy and as many different technologies as could be identified, both for how energy is currently used and the technologies that might be used in place of current technologies, and with some forecasted future. And then we looked at different scenarios, each of which had to achieve the emissions reductions that I showed you in that earlier chart. So except for the reference case, all of these scenarios that are depicted here achieve those emissions reductions over time. They do it in somewhat different ways. And of course, there are a lot of similarities in those scenarios, despite their differences. They all involve a lot more electricity than we're using currently. Because the great thing about electricity is we have the technology to make it without greenhouse gas emissions, and then it can be substituted for the direct use of fossil fuels for transportation or buildings or even industry. So we looked at different scenarios for each one solving for the overall emissions reduction that we needed to achieve. And then we looked at the costs and the technologies that would be required to do that. We looking specifically at the electricity sector, what we saw in that, so in this chart, the top row is where the electricity comes from. So it's the generation that we would need. You can see, I want to focus in particular on the electrification scenario, the second one from the left, because that's the one that, generally speaking, seemed to be the preferred strategy that emerged from our work. And we see a lot more electricity being required as we transform some of the other end uses like transportation and buildings over to electricity. And then in that chart, the green portion is the electricity that in the modeling we found would come from outside the state of Washington. The blue part represents electricity that would be generated within the state. It'd be clean electricity from wind or solar inside the state. And then the bottom row, that shows the load, the amount of electricity that would be demanded by our economy. And if you look at the electrification case there, you can see that, you know, as we start to convert a lot of other end uses to electricity, that shows up in the demand for electricity. And the yellow one, what's indicated there is flexible industrial load. It's a type of load that we generally don't even have today. It could include things like producing hydrogen from clean electricity and then using it either for industrial purposes or for fuels and other sectors. So this, it shows, you know, just in a very broad sense, the sources and uses of electricity that we would see. And I want to also point you a little bit to the chart on the far right. This is a scenario that we did where we looked at what would happen if we couldn't actually get to new renewables in other states above and beyond the transmission capacity that we have now. And in that scenario, not surprisingly, you see that more of the electricity comes from inside the state. So that blue section is bigger in that chart than it is in the electrification section, though that really tends to occur in the out years. I mean, like say from 2040 and 2050, maybe even 2035, more so than in say 2030. And that would largely be accomplished in this modeling by additional use of offshore wind. Offshore wind doesn't really show up in the other cases, but if we don't have transmission capacity available to us, then offshore wind starts to look better. A little more detail on where all these imported sources of electricity would come from. The pie charts on the left kind of show the mix both today and in the 2050 outcome in the electrification scenario. We'd still be generating more than half of our electricity within the state, but we'd be importing substantial amounts of, in particular, wind from Wyoming and Montana, and then solar would be coming from the Southwest, Nevada, and Arizona. And then this chart, I think, is one that maybe is going to be of interest to people in particular because it illustrates that the transmission capacity requirements that we saw in this modeling. The chart at the top is a very stylized map of the transmission system today. In this modeling, we're really just looking at state to state paths and losing a lot of detail about individual locations within states and things like that. And the thickness of the lines indicates the amount of capacity across those different paths. So we see in the top one, what exists in 2020, and then the bottom one shows what's would be required under the electrification strategy by 2050. And in general, we, in our modeling, we didn't assume that you could just increase transmission capacity infinitely. We assumed that no more than 6 gigawatts could be added on any given path. And we saw that east to west route from Montana to Washington, pegged out. I mean, basically we got as much as our inputs allowed for that type of transmission. One thing that we also see in this modeling is that not only can we get more renewables if we have a stronger transmission system, but we can also reach a greater diversity of renewable resources, ones that will allow us to build a portfolio that overall is more reliable and less expensive than if we had to basically make all of our own internally. And then, as I mentioned before, in that constrained resources scenario, we find that if we're unable to expand these transmission systems, then the plan would call for more solar located within Washington, and also the use of offshore wind that otherwise doesn't show up in this modeling.
Glenn, I had a couple of questions come into the chat before you switch there. The first question is, will increases in natural gas plant production for electrolysis be allowed in the interim as we progress to greenhouse gas-free electricity generation?
I mean, I don't know of any law that prohibits people from continuing to use natural gas to produce hydrogen. I'm not aware of anybody who would want to use natural gas to make electricity and then use that electricity for electrolysis for hydrogen. But I'm just not familiar with that circumstance. But the electricity, I mean, eventually hydrogen produced using natural gas as an input, there's no existing law that prohibits that I can think of right now.
Great. Lindsay, I don't know if you had any other follow-up that you wanted to do. If that, give me a thumbs up if that answered your question. Perfect. Thank you. Joe, we had a second, I'm sorry, Glenn, we had a second question coming from Joe. Just a question of why, any rationale behind the use of 6 gigawatts in the modeling?
That was our consultant's, recommended limit on that, based on their experience. I don't have a lot of additional detail on that. Some of our utility members may have thoughts on that later.
Okay, great. So another question come in, Glenn, how much cross-state planning is occurring? Is Commerce regularly in contact with counterparts in other states for parity in planning?
We have, since this strategy came out, started to spend more time on these interstate discussions of transmission planning. That's been prompted in part by a lot of new interest at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and in Congress about improving our ability to build these big region-wide transmission systems, or upgrade them. So and we're learning a lot about that and finding that there's not a lot there in terms of forward-looking planning. I probably shouldn't spend too much time on that right now, but I would say I think there's a lot of work to be done in that area.
Great. Thank you, Glenn. I appreciate that. Those are all the questions in the chat. Why don't we maybe flip to the next
Okay.
slide?
Yeah, and so what I've done in those last few slides is talk about the modeling that we did to help us kind of, understand energy use and the the possibilities available to us in the future. What this slide discusses is the recommended actions that came out of that energy strategy work. So what we identified as kind of the priority actions within the electric sector are to enhance the grid in terms of reliability and resource adequacy. We really need to keep our eye on that as we add more and more renewable resources. And then we need to accelerate the acquisition of new generating resources, especially renewables, and expand the transmission system. So the policy direction that we saw from that 2019 law that we're using kind of as our charter for this work, we would write that today even more vigorously in favor of identifying ways to strengthen our transmission system compared to what we were saying about it in 2019. And then we need to make the grid smarter, have more flexibility on the demand side of the grid to make up for the fact that we're not going to have those dispatchable thermal resources so much anymore. And then we need to do more to develop market mechanisms so that we can get clean electricity out of a well-functioning market. And then kind of a broad recommendation is that we continue to work for effective implementation of CETA as kind of our fundamental law in this area. And then more of a overall vision of how 2050 looks. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one, but in the lower left section of this vision statement for 2050, we see expanded transmission as kind of a core to an electricity sector that uses zero carbon electricity. It relies on our hydroelectric resources for energy and for keeping our electric system in balance. And then we need to build more flexible loads and a smarter grid to make the electricity system work better in the future. So that is what's actually maybe a more detailed presentation of some of those electricity elements than I've ever done for the energy strategy. So we'll see how I did.
Fabulous. Nicholas, jump right in.
Hey, Glenn. I was curious, on the chart you had where you had the grids as it looks now and the grid as it might look in 2050, it indicates, I think it was 6 new gigawatts of generation from Montana and 5 from Idaho, but it also looks like there's a tremendous amount of build between Idaho and Wyoming, Wyoming and Colorado, and so on and so forth. And I'm curious, since obviously those are outside our jurisdiction, if that build doesn't happen, does it still make sense from the modeling you've done to add the amount of transmission that you indicate here, the 6 and 5? Did you do that analysis?
We did not look at that that scenario,
Okay.
but I did. I want to note that we did as best we could to incorporate everybody's policies throughout the West in trying to do this. So the transmission build out that you see illustrated in that 2050 chart is not all prompted by the Washington needs. It's reflecting what we see going on in many different states in the West. And so, several places need new renewables. really everybody needs the ability to balance their resource portfolios. And even if you're operating thermal units in a state that has no clean energy law, you're better off with a more robust transmission system.
Yeah,
but I don't really know what would happen if you started to pull some of the other legs off that grid and in other places. What would happen to ours?
yeah, no, everything you say, I agree with 100%. I'm just wondering what would happen, because if some of these, intermediate legs aren't built, then there may be some supply constraints that would mean that we couldn't get all of this. We couldn't use all of the 6 or all of the 5 gigawatts that are indicated here in certain times. So I'm not saying it's wrong. I don't know. I'm just curious. Thanks.
Yeah, and again, we didn't model it, but I look at that leg from that connects California to Wyoming, and I think, boy, if that didn't get to be built up, then we might have an easier time picking up the Wyoming wind.
Oh, absolutely. And that's all of, we don't know what the future was going to look like. And so I agree with that 100%, but there may be opportunities if it's not all of that's built, who knows?
Yeah, right.
Great. Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you, Glenn. Other questions for Glenn, and feel free to ask him to flip back to a previous slide like Nicholas did as well. Yeah, Anders, please.
I had a question when you had talked about the offshore wind.
Yeah.
Is this model assuming that the transmission capacity already exists from the coast to into the larger load centers?
No, it's not. But it assumes that capacity essentially would be part of the if we choose offshore wind, we need to be able to interconnect it to the existing grid.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Anders. Okay, we probably have time for 2-3 more questions. And so I want to, again, as my opening, I wanted to invite folks to run out of questions and then come up with more questions, because I do think that some of the modeling work here that was done in preparation of the clean energy strategy is going to be a core input into the work that we do, particularly in establishing the needs, and then starting to think about some of the implications for the needs. So I want to make space for as many questions and clarifications as folks have here.
Glenn, Kathleen, earlier there was a discussion this morning about importing power from BC, and that's not portrayed. Is it foreseen in the energy strategy?
That's been one of what I think of as a limitation of the modeling that we did here, is that it doesn't incorporate the potential to purchase or trade with British Columbia or Alberta. So it's not explicitly included in the modeling. I see it as an opportunity maybe to go do better than what we might have found in the modeling if we were able to secure clean resources and get them delivered into the central Puget Sound area from Canada. That could be a better option than some of the things that are kind of on the upper end of the range in terms of cost or feasibility that the model picked.
And that brings up the other question I had, because as I was a participant on the advisory group last year, and one of the ways or the inputs into developing this set of resources was a cost element. And so I think you said if it becomes more costly in one area, offshore wind on the other. You didn't explicitly say this, but having been on the group, I read it from your mind. That's because then the offshore wind by cost comparison would be more likely. Is that an accurate reading of what you were saying earlier?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and you know, it's good to remember that we're always meeting those emissions reduction targets. And so in the modeling, if we lose kind of a preferred resource like Wyoming wind, we say, oh, but we just can't get that. Then we go and look for something else that kind of by definition is going to be more expensive, but is the least more expensive. And so, because we still need electricity for those cars and houses. And so then we look at what's the next one, and maybe that's offshore wind, as the next item in merit order.
So I think that's important for people to understand that what came out of the strategy, there was a cost assessment for the least costly alternative, because we talked also about cost this morning. So thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you. Clint.
Glenn, there's always a correlation between transmission and generation. Does the energy strategy take into consideration climate change and the pressure always on to spill more for the existing generation resources and potentially generation showing up in other locations?
Yeah. We had many a conversation about that kind of at the beginning of our modeling work, because at the same time the Northwest Power Planning Council was really digging in on that. And by the time we kind of needed to get our modeling done, we didn't feel like we had really a good set of alternative inputs for what the hydro system would produce under a different set of climate circumstances. We've now seen some of those results in the draft power plan, and my sense is that our energy strategy work is still generally in good shape compared to that, that the climate alternatives don't so drastically affect the hydro generation that it kind of renders our results unusable. But I'm curious about that.
Thank you, Glenn.
Consider everything. Thanks.
Thank you, Clint. Okay, Anders, I'm going to be moving to you after one more question if we've got anything. Anders, did you want us to run the PowerPoint deck for you, or did you want to run the PowerPoint deck?
If you could run it, and then I'll just indicate when to change slides, that'd be great.
Yep, no problem. All right, so we're going to switch slide decks while we do that. And we have time for one more question. If folks have anything else for Glenn?
I have a quick question. This is Joe. Was there some level of, in the modeling work, was there some level of sort of an inventory of in-state resources, wind and solar resources? And if so, did the inventory involve looking at resources that were only currently within close proximity to transmission, if that makes sense?
Yeah, we used data from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory to try to characterize the potential resources. Of course, we had data on existing resources and incorporated those, but then for how we grow, we used potential estimates that come out of NREL, and not really any detail on kind of transmission access. So in the strategy, we didn't say, well, okay, but how much of that solar resources could be easily interconnected with the existing transmission system? We abstracted away from that, as they say.
Okay. Part of the reason I ask is because the grid today is pretty much designed around thermal generation, and so there are potentially places with commercial wind and solar resource that simply aren't viable now because there is a lack of transmission. So I guess that's something that we need to think about. And to my knowledge, most of BPA's transmission planning, a lot of it comes out of transmission service requests from developers that are there because the resource there is there and the transmission is there. And that's why they're requesting access. So, thanks.
Sure.